He only wanted a bed for the night. The alien women had bigger plans for the only male. Kael Maddox hadn't slept in 3 days, and the universe was starting to blur at the edges. The whetstone groaned beneath him, her port thruster venting a thin trail of superheated coolant into the void like blood from a wound that wouldn't clot. Every warning light on the console had graduated from amber to red sometime around hour 50, and he'd stopped reading them around hour 60. There was no point. He knew what they said. "You're dying out here, and so is this ship." He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm, the stubble on his jaw catching against his wrist. 34 years old, and he moved like a man of 50. The siege of Caldera had done that. 2 years in the Alliance Marines pinned inside a collapsing orbital station while the Krell hammered it from outside, tended to age a body in ways that didn't show on paper. He'd mustered out with a functioning spine and a deep, marrow-level distrust of anything that looked like a plan. Since then, he'd hauled cargo, industrial solvents, mining equipment, atmospheric processors, whatever paid and didn't ask questions. The Whetstone was a modified Griffin-class hauler, tough but aging, held together with patch welds and stubbornness, and the quiet understanding between a man and his ship that neither of them had anywhere better to be. The nav console chimed, weak signal, beacon frequency. Kyle leaned forward, ignoring the protest from his lower back. The signal was faint, cycling on an old Confederation code pattern that hadn't been standard in decades. He cross-referenced the coordinates against every database the Whetstone carried. Vela 4, a tidally locked moon orbiting a gas giant called Marin's Cradle, listed as uninhabited in every nav chart he had access to. No stations, no outposts, no registered settlements, but the beacon was real. Someone was down there broadcasting on a frequency that meant safe harbor in a language the galaxy had mostly forgotten. He checked the fuel gauge, checked it again. The Whetstone wouldn't make the next station, not even close. Vela 4 was the only option that didn't end with him floating dead in a metal coffin between stars. "All right," he muttered to no one. "Fuel, a patch kit, and somewhere to lie down. That's the deal. Nothing else." The descent was rough. The Whetstone shuddered through Vela 4's thin atmosphere, like a drunk stumbling downstairs, her damaged thruster firing in uneven bursts that made Kael's teeth ache. He brought her down on a plateau of dark stone, overlooking a canyon so deep its bottom disappeared into permanent shadow. The sky above was amber and violet, caught in the perpetual twilight of a world that never fully turned toward its sun. Marin's Cradle dominated the horizon, a massive striped giant whose reflected light painted everything in hues of copper and bruised purple. Below the plateau, carved into the canyon wall itself, was a settlement. Kyle killed the engines and stared. The structures weren't built. They were grown. Curved walls of some organic material rose from the rock face like ribs from a chest, smooth and seamless, their surfaces faintly luminous in the half-light. Walkways connected them at various levels, threading through the cliff like veins. No ships on the landing plateau, no visible tech beyond the architecture itself. But lights glowed in the openings, warm and steady, and somewhere down there, something was alive. He pulled on his jacket, checked the charge on his sidearm, and stepped out into air that tasted like copper and cold stone. The walk from the plateau to the settlement's outer gate took 12 minutes. Long enough for the fatigue to settle back into his bones, for the weight of 3 sleepless days to remind him that willpower had limits. The gate was an archway of the same biocomposite material, its surface etched with patterns that pulsed faintly, responding to something he couldn't see. It was already open. Standing inside as if she'd been waiting was a woman. She was tall, taller than him by 2 or 3 inches, which didn't happen often. Her skin was a deep, luminous blue, the color of a lake at dusk, and it carried patterns beneath the surface, faint traceries of light that shifted as he watched. Her hair was silver white, pulled back from a face that was striking in the way a blade is striking. Beautiful and precise and not entirely safe. She wore a simple wrapped garment of dark fabric, and she regarded him with eyes the color of pale amber, steady and unblinking. "You're the pilot," she said. Her standard was fluent, but the rhythm was different, each word placed with deliberate care, like stones in a path. "Kael Maddox," he said. "Hauler, my ship's damaged. I need fuel and repair materials. I can pay." She studied him for a long moment. The patterns on her skin shifted, a slow pulse of blue-white that traveled from her temples down her neck. "I am Saelith," she said. "Come inside." She turned and walked into the settlement without looking back, as if it had already been decided. Kael followed. He told himself it was because he had no other options. That was mostly true. The interior of the settlement was warmer than the plateau, heated by some system embedded in the walls themselves. The biocomposite radiated a gentle warmth that seeped into his aching muscles as he walked. The corridors were wide, curving organically, lit by the same soft luminescence that patterned the outer walls. Everything was clean, maintained, alive in a way that buildings made of metal and concrete never were. The air smelled faintly of something floral, underlaid with the mineral tang of stone. He noticed the people almost immediately. Women, all of them. They moved through the corridors and open spaces of the settlement with the quiet purpose of people going about their lives. Some carried containers or tools. Others sat in small groups in alcove-like chambers off the main passages, talking in low voices. A few paused to look at him as he passed. Some stared openly, their luminescent patterns flickering in ways he couldn't read. Others looked away too fast, as if the sight of him was something they needed to process in private. Not a single male face among them. No children either. Kael's hand drifted closer to his sidearm without conscious thought. Saelith noticed. She didn't comment. She led him to a communal hall, a broad chamber with a vaulted ceiling that curved overhead like the inside of a shell. Low tables were arranged in clusters, and the air was warm with the smell of food. Saelith gestured to a seat and placed a plate in front of him without ceremony. Some kind of grain, a thick stew with vegetables he didn't recognize, a cup of water that was cold and tasted of minerals. He ate like a man who hadn't had a real meal in days because he hadn't. The food was unfamiliar but good, rich, filling, with flavors that didn't map to anything in his experience. He scraped the plate clean and drank the water in 3 long swallows. Saelith watched him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Patience, maybe, or appraisal. "I need to discuss fuel and repair facilities," he said, setting down the cup. "Rest first," Saelith replied. "We can discuss logistics tomorrow." "I'd rather discuss them now." Something shifted in her expression. A flicker of amusement, maybe, or resignation. "Fuel is possible, but not immediately available. It needs to be prepared. The process takes time." "How much time?" "A day, perhaps 2. Kael didn't like the vagueness, but he was too tired to push harder. The food sat warm in his stomach, and the heat from the walls was doing things to his alertness that 3 days of adrenaline couldn't fight. "Fine, show me where I can sleep." The quarters she brought him to were clean and comfortable. A low bed with layered coverings, a wash basin with running water, a small window that looked out over the canyon's perpetual twilight. Almost too comfortable for a place that didn't officially exist. Kael checked the door. No lock. He noted this, filed it, and said nothing. He slept with his boots on and his sidearm under the pillow. He woke in the dark to the certainty that someone had been in the room. His hand found the sidearm instantly. Still there, exactly where he'd placed it, untouched. He lay still, breathing slowly, scanning the room with eyes adjusted to the dim glow from the walls. Nothing moved, no one present. But something was wrong, something had shifted. The med scanner. He'd left it in his jacket pocket, hanging on the wall hook. The jacket was still there. The scanner was in the same pocket. But it was warm, recently activated. Someone had used it on him while he slept. Kael dressed in the dark, holstered his weapon, and went to find Saelith. She was in the communal hall alone, seated at one of the low tables with a cup of something steaming between her hands. The settlement's twilight glow made the patterns on her skin look like constellations, slow-moving galaxies of blue-white light beneath the surface. "Someone scanned me while I slept," he said without preamble. Saelith set down her cup. She didn't deny it. "We needed to know if you were compatible," she said. "Compatible with what?" She looked at him for a long moment, and in the shifting light of her skin, He could see something that might have been regret. "Come with me," she said. "I'll show you." She led him down. Below the living quarters, below the communal spaces, below everything he'd seen of the settlement so far. The corridors narrowed and the temperature dropped as they descended into the canyon wall itself, deeper than the architecture above suggested. The biocomposite gave way to raw stone in places, then resumed as if the settlement had grown roots into the bedrock. The chamber at the bottom was vast. Kael stopped in the entrance and felt the air leave his chest. Rows of stasis pods stretched into the dim distance, hundreds of them, arranged with precise spacing on platforms that rose from the stone floor in gentle tiers. Each pod was made of the same biocomposite as the settlement above, curved and smooth, with a transparent panel that revealed the occupant within. The light in the chamber was soft, amber, pulsing gently in a rhythm that reminded him, uncomfortably, of a heartbeat. Inside every pod was an infant. Velhari infants, tiny and perfect, with skin of deep blue and wisps of silver-white hair, suspended, still, not dead, not alive, waiting in a space between the two that had no name he wanted to use. 347, Salith said beside him. Her voice was quiet, factual, the voice of someone who'd spoken this number so many times it had worn smooth. Conceived before the attack, unable to develop without the catalyst, suspended here for 7 years. Kael's mouth was dry. What attack? Salith walked between the rows, her fingers trailing just above the surface of one pod, not quite touching. 7 years ago, the Krell Ascendancy deployed a genetic weapon against our people. It targeted the male chromosomal structure specifically. Every Velhari male died within weeks. Every male embryo in development failed. She paused beside a pod where an infant's tiny hand was visible. Fingers curled loosely, frozen mid-gesture. Our species has 1 generation left. After that, nothing. The words landed in his chest like stones dropped into still water. These children were conceived before the weapon hit, she continued. But Velhari fetal development requires a protein catalyst, elurin, that is produced exclusively by male biology. Without it, the infants cannot complete gestation. They remain in stasis indefinitely, alive but never born. And you scanned me because human male physiology produces a nearly identical protein, in trace amounts, in the bone marrow. Salith turned to face him, and the patterns on her skin had gone still. No pulsing, no shifting, completely steady, like light held in glass. We discovered this 4 years ago. Since then, we've activated the beacon 14 times. 14 human ships have passed within range. She paused. All 14 left. The number sat between them. 14, he was 15. The beacon wasn't random, Kael said slowly. No. You lured me here. Yes. You scanned me without my consent. Yes. Anger arrived sharp and clean and welcome, because it was simpler than everything else pressing against the inside of his ribs. Fuel my ship. I'm leaving. Salith nodded. No argument, no pleading, no guilt in her expression, or if there was, she kept it hidden behind that steady light. Your ship will be fueled by morning, she said. You're free to leave. He turned and walked back through the rows of pods, past hundreds of unborn children suspended in amber light, and he kept his eyes forward and his jaw tight and his hands and fists at his sides. He was leaving. That was decided. He didn't owe these people anything. They'd manipulated him, lured him, scanned him like livestock. He owed them nothing. He was almost at the chamber's exit when he passed a woman he hadn't noticed on the way in. She was younger than Salith, shorter, slighter, with patterns on her skin that shifted in rapid, restless waves. She was sitting on the stone floor beside one of the pods, her legs folded beneath her, one hand pressed flat against the transparent panel. Through the glass, an infant's face was visible, eyes closed, expression peaceful in a way that made something behind Kael's sternum crack. The woman was whispering to the child inside, low, musical, in a language he didn't understand. She didn't look up as he passed. She didn't notice him at all. Her entire world had narrowed to the span of one pod and the daughter who couldn't hear her. Kael kept walking. He didn't stop, but he couldn't stop hearing it either. That whisper followed him up through the corridors, into his quarters, into the bed where he sat on the edge and stared at his boots for a long time. He was leaving in the morning. That was decided. He took off his boots. He couldn't sleep. He told himself it was the unfamiliar gravity, the faint hum of the biocomposite walls, the absence of engine vibration that had been his lullaby for 12 years. It was none of those things. It was the pods. 347 unborn children, suspended in amber light, waiting for something that 14 men before him had decided wasn't their problem. He found himself walking the settlement's corridors in what passed for the small hours. The twilight never changed on Vela 4. No dawn approaching, no deepening dark to mark the passage of time. The sky through every window was the same amber and violet it had been when he arrived. Marin's cradle hanging motionless on the horizon, its banded surface reflecting light that had traveled millions of kilometers to paint this canyon in hues of copper and old gold. The women of the settlement moved on a rhythm he couldn't perceive. Some corridors were empty, quiet as tombs. Others held small gatherings, women talking in low voices around shared cups of something warm, their bioluminescent patterns casting moving constellations on the curved walls. Some acknowledged him as he passed. A nod, a glance, the briefest flicker of light across a cheekbone. Others continued their conversations without pause, treating his presence as neither threat nor event. Just weather. Just the strange human moving through their home with his heavy boots and his heavy thoughts. He turned a corner and nearly walked into the oldest woman he'd ever seen. She was small, bent at the shoulders, her blue skin faded to a pale frost that was almost translucent. Her patterns were dim, barely visible, like the last embers of a fire that had been burning for centuries. Because it had. Velhari lifespans stretched 6 times longer than a human's, and this woman wore her years in the lines of her face and the slow, deliberate precision of her movements. She reached out and touched his hand. Just touched it. Her fingers were cold and dry and light as paper. She said something in Velhari, a single sentence, musical and measured, and her patterns pulsed once, blue-white, then faded. He didn't ask for a translation. Something told him the words weren't the point. The touch was the point. The acknowledgement that he was here, that he was real, that his presence registered in a life that had seen 4 centuries of everything else. Thessaly, Saleth told him later, the eldest, she remembers the world before the Krell, before the Confederation, before humans discovered fire. She was already old. Kael found his way to the stasis chamber almost without deciding to. The amber glow drew him down the descending corridors like gravity, inevitable and patient. Vela was there. Of course she was. He was beginning to understand that she was always there. She looked up as he entered, and the surprise on her face was genuine. Not alarm, just the disorientation of someone whose solitary ritual had been interrupted for the first time in 7 years. "You're still here," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. "Ship's not fueled yet," he replied, which was technically true and completely beside the point. She studied him for a moment, then shifted slightly on the stone floor, making space. An invitation so small it could be ignored. He sat down beside her, his back against the pod's platform, his legs stretched out on the cold stone. They sat in silence for a while. The chamber hummed with the steady pulse of the stasis systems, a sound that was almost biological, almost like breathing. "What was she like?" Kael asked. "Before." Vela's hand resting on the pod's surface twitched. "Before? Your partner?" Naya's father. The patterns on her skin shifted, slow, deep pulses of blue that traveled from her shoulders to her fingertips. He was a builder, designed the upper terrace levels of the settlement. He liked to work with his hands even though the biocomposite responds to vocal commands. He said touching the material made it grow better. A pause. He was probably right. The sections he built by hand are stronger than the rest. "What was his name?" "Thaniel." She said it carefully, the way you handle something fragile that you haven't held in a long time. "He died on the 4th day of the plague, faster than most. I used to be angry about that. Now I think it was a mercy." Kael didn't offer comfort. Comfort implied understanding, and he didn't understand. Couldn't. What he could do was sit on cold stone beside a woman who'd been sitting alone for 7 years and let the silence hold both of them. "The extraction," he said. "How does it work?" The question surprised her again. He could see it in the way her patterns flickered, a stutter of light that betrayed the composure she wore like armor. "A marrow draw, mild discomfort, repeated every 3 days for 6 to 8 weeks. Each session produces enough catalyst for roughly 5 infants." He did the math. Nearly 70 sessions, 4.5 months minimum. His cargo delivery deadline was in 11 days. The penalties would be real. The damage to his reputation would be real. The life waiting for him out there, thin as it was, would not survive his absence. "They all leave," Vela said quietly. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the pod, at the infant inside, at the face of a daughter who existed in the space between heartbeats. 14 ships. Some stayed a day, one stayed a week. They were kind about it mostly, apologetic, but they left. The sentence was quiet and factual, and it landed like a blade. He went back to his quarters, sat on the edge of the bed, stared at his boots. Then he stood up and walked to the communal hall, where Salith sat alone with her datapad and her departure vectors. "Show me the medbay," he said. Morning on Vela 4 looked exactly like night. The perpetual twilight didn't shift. The amber sky held steady, and Marn's cradle hung motionless on the horizon, its reflected light painting the canyon in unchanging hues of copper. Time here wasn't something you saw. It was something you measured by the rhythms of the people around you. Kael found Salith at the communal hall. She had a datapad ready, fuel calculations displayed, his departure vector already plotted. She'd prepared everything. Clean, efficient, no friction. He could walk to the whetstone and leave within the hour. "How does the extraction work?" he asked. The question surprised her. He could see it in the brief stutter of the patterns on her skin, a pulse of bright white that flared and settled. "A bone marrow draw," she said carefully. "Mild discomfort. Repeated every 3 days for 6 to 8 weeks. Each session produces enough allurin for approximately 5 infants." He did the math. Nearly 70 sessions for all 347 pods, 4.5 months minimum. His cargo delivery deadline was in 11 days. Industrial solvents bound for a mining outpost in the Helion sector. Replaceable, impersonal. The kind of job that existed, so people like him didn't have to think about purpose. If he missed the delivery, the contract would default. Penalties. His reputation in the hauling circuit, already thin, would crater. He'd be starting over from nothing. He stared at the datapad with his departure vector on it for a long time. "The woman in the stasis chamber," he said. "By the pod. Who is she?" "Vela," Salith said. Something in her voice softened around the name. "Her daughter was conceived 3 days before the bioweapon struck. She's been sitting beside that pod for 7 years. 7 years. Every day." Kael picked up the datapad, looked at the departure vector, set it back down. "Show me the medbay," he said. The first extraction was handled by a Velhari medic named Doran. She was compact, precise, and entirely humorless. She prepped his arm, positioned the draw needle, and worked with the focused efficiency of someone who treated emotion as an obstacle to accuracy. The draw ached, a deep, dull throb that settled into his bones and stayed there like a low note humming beneath his awareness. "You'll feel fatigue for several hours," Doran said, sealing the vial of marrow extract with practiced hands. "Increased appetite is normal. I'll provide dietary supplements." She looked at him the way a mechanic looks at a part. Functional assessment. Nothing personal. Same time in 3 days. He respected her for it. Days passed. He fell into a rhythm, which was dangerous because rhythms meant staying, and staying meant caring. And caring was the thing he'd spent 12 years carefully avoiding. Mornings he worked on the whetstone, checking systems, tightening seals, running diagnostics, keeping her flight ready out of habit, or maybe out of a need to remind himself that leaving was still an option. The ship sat on the plateau like a promise he wasn't sure he intended to keep. Sometimes he'd sit in the pilot's seat and stare at the nav console with its galaxy of possible destinations, and each time they looked a little farther away. Not in distance, in something else. Afternoons, he walked the settlement. The corridors were a labyrinth of curved passages and open chambers, and each day he discovered more. Beneath the organic architecture was sophisticated technology, energy systems that drew power from the gas giant's electromagnetic field through antenna arrays woven into the canyon wall. Agricultural bays carved into deeper chambers where bioluminescent crops grew in the reflected light, purple and silver, photosynthesizing without a sun. The plants pulsed gently in cycles that matched the stasis chamber's rhythm, as if the entire settlement breathed on a single clock. A communications array sat dormant on the canyon rim above, its antenna folded against the rock like a closed fist. It hadn't transmitted in years. These people weren't primitive. They were hiding. The settlement ran on discipline disguised as domesticity. Work rotations, maintenance schedules, security watches that changed at intervals Kael could set his chrono by. Saelith managed all of it with a calm that looked effortless until you watched closely enough to see the strain beneath. She carried the settlement the way load-bearing walls carry a roof, invisibly, structurally, in a way that meant everything collapsed if she stepped aside. Evenings, he sat with Vela near the stasis chamber. They talked in fragments at first, small, careful sentences, testing the weight of each word before releasing it. She told him about the settlement before the plague, the sounds of children in the upper terraces, the way Thaniel's laughter used to echo off the canyon walls in a way that made the biocomposite hum sympathetically. How the mornings, the Velhari equivalent of mornings, used to feel different when there was someone to wake up beside. Kael listened. He wasn't good at comfort, never had been, but he could sit still, and sometimes that was enough. He began to notice small things, the way her patterns calmed when she talked about her daughter, shifting from their restless flickering to something slower, warmer. The way she leaned slightly toward him when he spoke, as if his voice occupied a frequency she'd been missing. The way she never asked him how long he was staying, because the question would have required an answer, and neither of them was ready for that. The women's reactions to him varied, and he paid attention to the variation because it told him things words didn't. Some were warm, curious, open, drawn to him with an intensity that made the air feel charged whenever he entered a room. He was the first male they'd seen in 7 years, and for some of them, his presence cracked open, something that had been sealed shut. They brought him food he hadn't asked for, showed him parts of the settlement he hadn't found, touched his arm when they spoke to him, casually as if testing whether contact with a human felt different from memory. One young woman, barely out of adolescence by Velhari standards, blushed so deeply her entire pattern system went incandescent when he caught her watching him from across the communal hall. She fled. He pretended not to notice. Others were guarded, polite but distant, watching him from behind walls of composure that he recognized because he'd built similar ones himself. These women measured his presence in risk, not hope. A human in the settlement was a variable, and variables were dangerous when your survival depended on control. And then there was Riven. She was a former soldier. He could see it in the way she moved, in the economy of her gestures, in the way she assessed every room she entered by its exits and sightlines. She was shorter than most Velhari women, compact and dense with muscle, and her bioluminescent patterns ran in sharp, angular lines rather than the flowing curves he'd seen on the others. War markings, maybe, scars of a different kind. She made it clear from the first day that she didn't trust him and didn't want him here. Dependence on a human, she said to Saelith within his earshot deliberately, is weakness. Kael didn't argue. He understood the arithmetic of her anger without needing it explained. She'd lost someone. The way she avoided the stasis chamber, the way her jaw tightened whenever she heard one of the other women speak about the infants, the way she looked at him not with hatred, but with something worse, the furious, helpless recognition that he had something she needed, and she couldn't afford to refuse it. She'd lost her partner, her sons, all of them in weeks. And now a human stranger was the only reason her species might continue. He gave her space. It was the only thing he could offer that didn't cost her dignity. One evening, Saelith found him on the plateau beside the whetstone. He was sitting on the landing strut, looking out over the canyon where the settlement's lights glowed against the rock face like embers in a hearth. The Krell who deployed the bioweapon. he said without turning. "They're still out there." Saleth sat beside him. The distance between them was precise, close enough for conversation, far enough for comfort. "The beacon only activates in narrow windows," she said, "targeting human frequency channels. It's a calculated risk every time. And if the Krell find you, they will finish what they started." He looked at her. The amber light of Marin's cradle caught the patterns on her skin, and for a moment, she looked like something carved from the canyon itself. Ancient, enduring, and tired in a way that went deeper than bone. "How long have you been the one holding all of this together?" he asked. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The first infant woke on his 9th day. Doran handled the procedure with the same clinical precision she brought to everything. No ceremony, no speeches, no drama. 5 pods activated with the Allurin from Kael's first 2 sessions. She loaded the catalyst into the pod's internal delivery system, calibrated the dosage, and stepped back. The process was gentle, almost anticlimactic in its quietness. The biocomposite pods shifted, softened, their surfaces rippling like water disturbed by a dropped stone. Then they opened, slowly, petal by petal, revealing infants who had been suspended between existence and absence for 7 years. The first child drew breath with a sound that was barely audible. A thin, reedy gasp, like a question asked in the dark. Her eyes opened, unfocused, searching for a world she'd never seen. And then she cried. It was the most ordinary sound in the universe. A newborn crying. Every species that bore live young had heard it. There was nothing remarkable about it except that this cry had been waiting 7 years to happen, and the chamber was full of women who had spent those 7 years wondering if they would ever hear it again. The chamber filled with a sound Kael had never heard before. Every Velhari woman present made a low harmonic tone. It wasn't voluntary. He could see it in their faces. The surprise, the way some of them pressed their hands to their own throats as if trying to understand what was happening. The tone rose from somewhere deep, somewhere biological, a frequency wired into the species at a level deeper than culture or choice. Their bioluminescent patterns synchronized, waves of light rolling across every woman in the room in the same rhythm, the same pulse, until the entire chamber breathed with it. Light and sound and something older than both, a biological response to survival-level emotion that the Velhari couldn't have suppressed if they'd wanted to. It was grief in reverse, mourning transforming into something that didn't have a name in any language he spoke. Kael stood in the middle of it, the only person in the room whose skin didn't glow, the only person whose throat didn't vibrate with that ancient tone, and he felt it anyway, in his chest, in the marrow they'd been drawing from his bones, in the place where he kept the things he didn't talk about. The mother held her child for the first time in 7 years, and the sound she made was private, individual, separate from the collective harmonic, her own frequency, her own particular joy, shaped by her own particular loss. Vela's pod wasn't in the first batch. She stood at the edge of the chamber and watched the other mothers hold their children. Her expression was perfectly still, carefully assembled, the composure of someone who'd had 7 years of practice at watching other people receive the things she wanted most. Her hand pressed flat against the glass of her daughter's pod, fingers splayed, as if she could transfer warmth through the barrier by will alone. Kael stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The alarm was silent, a pulse of red light through every corridor, steady and insistent, like a heartbeat accelerating. Kael recognized the pattern from military installations, battle stations without the noise. Every woman in the settlement moved with trained precision, flowing into positions that spoke of rehearsal, of drills repeated until they became instinct. This wasn't the first time. Saleth found him in under a minute. Her face was composed, but her patterns were flickering, rapid shifts of blue and white that betrayed the calm in her voice. A Krell destroyer-class patrol vessel has entered Vela 4's orbital space, she said. Routine sweep, or they detected the beacon's last activation. Either way, we go dark. No emissions, no movement, no heat signatures above ambient. Kael's fatigue evaporated. The exhaustion that had been his constant companion for weeks burned off in a rush of adrenaline that felt like coming home. His body remembered this, the tightening of focus, the sharpening of perception, the cold clarity that settled over everything like frost. The infants, he said, 5 newborns who cry, who radiate heat, who don't understand silence. Salith's jaw tightened. Doran and the mothers are managing it, but a Krell deep scan could detect elevated biological signatures even through the canyon wall. He assessed the settlement's defensive capabilities in the time it took to breathe twice. Minimal. A handful of personal weapons, the settlement's camouflage systems, and the canyon's natural electromagnetic interference. Against a Krell destroyer with a crew of 100 and enough firepower to level a city, it was nothing. The communications array, he said. Can we call for help? Salith shook her head. Activating it would be a flare. Through the settlement's passive sensors, he watched the situation deteriorate. The Krell ship descended toward the surface. Not directly overhead, but close enough. A landing party deployed. 6 soldiers, standard recon configuration, fanning out across the canyon floor in a sweep pattern that was systematic, thorough, and heading in their direction. Kael made his decision the way he'd made every important decision in his life. Quickly, without ceremony, and with the full understanding that he'd probably regret it. I'll draw them off, he said. The Whetstone. A human ship on an uninhabited moon is unusual but explainable. A drifter with engine trouble, it gives them something to investigate that isn't 200 women and their children. Salith's patterns went still. If they suspect, they won't. I've been selling bullshit to people with guns since I was 19. It's the only skill I've got that improves with age. He was moving toward the airlock when Riven stepped into his path. She stood in the corridor like a wall, arms crossed, patterns sharp and angular, every line of her body broadcasting hostility and something underneath it that was harder to name. You'll expose us, she said. He explained his logic. Calmly, clearly, the way you explain a tactical plan to someone who understands tactics. If the Krell find the settlement, everyone dies. If they find a lone human hauler with engine trouble, they investigate, confirm he's harmless, and leave. The math was simple. The risk was his. Riven stared at him for a long moment. Her patterns shifted, a slow, grudging transition from sharp angles to something fractionally less hostile. Then she unholstered her personal sidearm and held it out to him. A Velhari pulse lance. Elegant, powerful, the kind of weapon that was built to be part of its owner. It was biometrically locked, and she placed her thumb on the grip sensor and unlocked it manually, resetting the authorization to neutral. The gesture cost her something. He could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the way she didn't quite meet his eyes. Don't miss, she said. Kael took the weapon, nodded, and walked out into the twilight. The plateau felt enormous with the canyon behind him and the Krell somewhere ahead. He powered up the Whetstone's non-essential systems, making noise, making light, making himself look like exactly what he was pretending to be. A down-on-his-luck hauler who'd landed for emergency repairs and wanted nothing more than to fix his ship and leave. He opened panels that didn't need opening, clanged tools against the hull, left the cockpit lights blazing and the cargo ramp down, the universal body language of a man with nothing to hide and nowhere urgent to be. The Krell patrol redirected toward him within minutes. 6 soldiers in dark armor that absorbed the twilight and gave nothing back, moving across the plateau with the synchronized efficiency of a species that had been waging war since before humanity discovered fire. Their weapons were plasma repeaters, squad grade, heavy and ugly and designed for one purpose. They weren't sidearms. They were statements. Their commander was a scarred female Krell named Voss. She was compact for her species, which still made her broader than Kael by a significant margin. Her scales were dark green, nearly black, with old battle damage visible as pale lines across her jaw and neck. A long scar bisected her left brow ridge, pulling the skin slightly, giving her face a permanent expression of skeptical assessment. She moved with the tired authority of a career officer who'd been assigned to a patrol sweep of a dead moon and wanted to finish it and go home. Kael knew the type. He'd served under officers like her. Competent, procedural, dangerous not because they were cruel, but because they were thorough. Cruelty could be distracted. Thoroughness couldn't. He met them at the base of the Whetstone's ramp. Hands visible, posture relaxed, voice easy. The posture of a man with a clear conscience and a dull life. "Engine trouble," he said. "Coolant leak. Should be patched by morning." Voss studied him with reptilian patience, her head tilting slightly in a gesture he recognized as assessment. Human, alone, on an uninhabited moon. "Nav error, emergency landing. You know how it is." He gestured toward the Whetstone's port thruster, where the genuine damage was still visible. Scorched plating, warped vents, the telltale discoloration of a coolant breach. "She's not pretty, but she'll fly once I get the seal replaced." "What cargo?" Voss asked, circling the ship slowly, her soldiers maintaining a loose perimeter. Her eyes cataloged everything. The patch welds on the hull, the non-standard antenna array, the age of the registration codes painted on the stern. "Industrial solvents, bound for the Helion sector. Nothing exciting." He shrugged with the perfect amount of boredom. "The manifest is in the cockpit if you want to see it." She didn't respond to that. Instead, she stopped at the ship's underbelly and examined the landing struts. Checking for signs of repeated landing, for wear patterns that would suggest the Whetstone had been here before, had been here often. The struts were clean. First landing. She noted this. "Bioscan," Voss ordered. One of her soldiers activated a handheld unit and swept the area. Kael watched the display from the corner of his eye, calculating distances. The settlement was 1.4 kilometers southeast, partially shielded by canyon rock and the biocomposite's natural interference properties. If the scanner was standard military grade, it might not reach. If it was upgraded, the scanner pulsed. The soldier's posture shifted. "Anomalous biological readings," the soldier reported. "Southeast, faint, possibly subterranean." Voss's eyes narrowed. "Native fauna," Kael said, letting the right amount of casual irritation enter his voice. "Saw some burrowing animals when I landed. Big ones. Nearly took my head off when I went looking for water." He gestured vaguely toward the canyon. "Wouldn't recommend going down there at night, or whatever passes for night on this rock." Voss considered. "Squad 2, investigate the southeast readings. Standard recon formation." Kael's stomach clenched, but his face didn't change. "I can guide you if you want. Already scouted most of the canyon looking for a water source. Save your people some time." Voss assigned a third soldier to watch him, and suddenly he was walking 3 Krell toward the settlement he was trying to protect. He led them on a wide arc, pointed out geological features with the rambling authority of a man who'd been bored and alone for days, invented wildlife encounters, described a nest of burrowing creatures near the eastern ridge that existed only in his imagination, giving it enough specific detail to sound credible. The soldiers scanned as they walked, their equipment humming in the still air. One of them found a water source, a small seep emerging from the canyon wall, leaving mineral traces on the rock. Kael identified it as natural spring runoff. It was actually irrigation overflow from the settlement's agricultural bays. Mineral content consistent with natural hydrothermal activity, the scanning soldier confirmed, and Kael allowed himself a breath. Then the scanner pinged again. The soldier stopped. Adjusted the frequency. The display shifted, and even from Kael's angle, he could see the difference. The reading was too large, too organized, too structured to be fauna. Neural complexity above the threshold. The soldier opened his mouth to report. Kael stumbled against the canyon wall. His boot hit a loose formation of rock at the base, and he went down hard, one hand catching Riven's pulse lance, where it was hidden beneath his jacket. The rock shifted. He triggered the lance on its lowest setting, a focused burst that shattered the unstable formation above the scanning soldier's position. Stone cascaded in a roar of dust and debris, burying the scanner under 2 feet of rubble. The soldier staggered back, cursing in Krell. His equipment sparked and died. "Careful," Kael said, picking himself up and dusting off his jacket. "Told you this canyon was unstable." Voss recalled her team 20 minutes later. She stood in front of Kael on the plateau, her scarred face unreadable, and he could feel her suspicion like a physical weight. But suspicion wasn't proof, and career military officers didn't start incidents without proof. Not on uninhabited moons that weren't worth the paperwork. "Unauthorized settlements on Krell-surveyed worlds," she said. are punishable by liquidation. Just me and my busted ship, Commander, Kael replied. Nothing else to see. She held his gaze for 3 seconds longer than necessary. Then she ordered a surveillance drone deployed in orbit and led her patrol back to their shuttle. The engines whined, lifted, and faded into the amber sky. Kael stood on the plateau until the sound was gone. Then he walked back to the settlement on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Salith met him at the gate. Her patterns were shifting in rapid, complex sequences, and she didn't ask what happened. She read it on his face. "How long before the drone detects us?" he asked. She checked a display set into the wall beside the gate. Her expression tightened. "Days," she said. "Maybe less." He laid it out in the communal hall, blunt and unvarnished. The drone was passive, solar-powered, limited but persistent. It would map the canyon in overlapping sweeps, each pass resolving more detail. Eventually it would see through the interference, through the biocomposite shielding, through every layer of concealment that had kept this settlement invisible for 7 years. And when it did, Voss would come back, not with 6 soldiers, with the full weight of a destroyer's complement and orders that didn't include asking questions. "Options," he said, ticking them off on his fingers. "Evacuate on foot. No ships, 200 women, 5 infants, open terrain with no cover. That's not an option, it's a death march. Destroy the drone. Alerts the Krell immediately. Same result, faster timeline." "Transmit a distress call," Salith said from across the table. The communications array was built to reach Confederation channels. If we can send a targeted burst to any Alliance vessel in range, the Krell would have to weigh their response. They don't want a war with the Alliance, not over a dead moon. And if there's no one in range, then we are no worse than we are now. Kael looked at her. "Activating the array will light up every scanner in the system. We'll have minutes before the drone relays the signal to the destroyer. Minutes after that before Voss returns. Yes, someone has to be on the canyon rim to operate the array. It's exposed. If the Krell come with air support, whoever's up there is a target." "Yes," he nodded. "Then I'll do it." Riven stood. "I'm going with you." He tried to refuse. She didn't ask twice. She simply walked beside him toward the exit, and her posture made it clear that arguing would waste time neither of them had. Vela found him before he reached the outer corridors. She appeared from a side passage, her patterns shifting in those restless, rapid waves he'd come to associate with her, and she pressed something into his hand without speaking. A small carved stone, dark, smooth, with veins of bioluminescent material running through it that pulsed with a faint, steady light. "Naya's birthstone," she said. "I was going to give it to her when she woke." She closed his fingers around it. Her hand was warm, and her patterns, just for a moment, held steady, a constant light against his skin. "Bring it back," she said. He put it in his vest pocket. Next to his identification chip and the cargo manifest for a delivery he was never going to make. The stone was warm against his chest, and the bioluminescent veins inside it pulsed with a light that matched his heartbeat. Or maybe his heartbeat matched it. He wasn't sure which came first. The climb was vertical in places. The biocomposite of the settlement's upper structures gave way to raw stone, dark and cold, slick with mineral deposits that made every handhold a negotiation between grip and gravity. Kael's muscles screamed from weeks of marrow draws and insufficient sleep, and the bruises from his encounter with the Krell patrol ached with every upward reach. His fingers found cracks in the stone, edges where biocomposite bonded with natural rock, and he pulled himself up one body length at a time through air that thinned and cooled as he climbed. Riven climbed like she'd been born on the rock face. Her hands and feet adhered to the stone through some biological mechanism he could see but not replicate. Adhesive cells in her palms and soles that gripped surfaces no human hand could hold. She moved without gear, without ropes, scaling the canyon wall with an ease that would have been humiliating if he'd had the energy to feel humiliated. An evolutionary trait from the Velhari's original homeworld. High-altitude cliff dwellers before they'd built cities and ships, and the kind of civilization that made other species afraid enough to try to erase them. Halfway up, Kael's left hand slipped. For one terrible second, his weight hung entirely on 3 fingers, and the toe of one boot jammed into a crack. The canyon yawned below him, dark and patient. Riven's hand closed around his wrist, strong, steady. Her adhesive grip locked onto his skin and held him until he found the next purchase. Neither of them acknowledged it. They kept climbing. At the top, the communications array stood skeletal against the amber sky, a lattice of biocomposite and salvaged metal, its antenna folded against the canyon rim like a broken wing. Cal's hands found the control interface and the technology responded to his touch with a reluctant hum, systems coming online for the first time in years. Modulating to Alliance emergency frequency, he said, adjusting the output. One burst, everything we've got. Riven positioned herself at the canyon's edge, pulse lance drawn, scanning the sky with the calm attention of someone who had done this before. Waited for violence, prepared for it, survived it. Kael activated the array. The signal fired, a compressed burst of data and desperate energy that screamed outward across every frequency the array could reach, carrying coordinates, identification, a plea encoded in the dry language of military protocol that translated, stripped of formality, to a single word: help. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the whine of engines began. 3 Krell assault shuttles descended through Vela 4's atmosphere in a formation that was designed for one thing: annihilation. They came fast and low, cutting through the twilight like black blades, weapons already charging. Voss wasn't guessing anymore. She wasn't sweeping. She was coming with the full authority of a species that had already decided this moon's inhabitants were a problem to be solved permanently. Kael and Riven held the canyon rim. The first wave targeted the array. Plasma fire scorched the stone around them, superheating the air until it tasted like copper and ozone, turning solid rock into glass where the bolt struck. Kael fired back with Riven's pulse lance, the weapon kicking against his shoulder with a force that felt personal, intimate, like the gun was trying to tell him something about the person who'd carried it before him. The shots were precise because they had to be. He had one weapon and a finite charge against a platoon of armored Krell soldiers who considered this moon their property and everything on it their right to destroy. Riven fought beside him with the cold efficiency of a woman who'd already lost everything she valued and had nothing left to protect except the principle of protection itself. Her pulse lance was an extension of her arm, finding targets with an accuracy that came from somewhere beyond training. Somewhere in the marrow, somewhere in the memory of 2 sons who died in her arms while a bioweapon ate them from the inside out, and a partner who'd followed 3 days later, and 7 years of rage that had finally found a direction to point itself. She didn't fight like someone who wanted to survive. She fought like someone who'd decided that if she was going to die, she was going to do it standing between a threat and the people behind her. The distinction mattered. Below, the settlement defended itself. Salith coordinated from the central corridor, her voice steady on the internal comm system, directing women who'd never held weapons into positions behind biocomposite barricades that absorbed plasma fire and healed around the scorch marks like living skin closing over wounds. Some of the women were steady, some were shaking, all of them were there. Doran stood at the entrance to the stasis chamber, a medical tool in one hand and a salvaged pistol in the other, her humorless expression unchanged by the chaos around her. If the Krell reached the pods, they'd have to go through her first, and the particular set of her jaw suggested they'd find it more difficult than they expected. The newly awakened infants cried in the deep shelters, their thin voices swallowed by stone. Mothers held them close, whispering in Velhari, their bioluminescent patterns dim and steady, the instinctive camouflage of a species that had learned to hide its light. Vela stood at the entrance to the infant ward with a blade and no intention of moving. Her patterns were still. Perfectly, absolutely still. The kind of stillness that wasn't peace but focus. The total concentration of a woman whose daughter was finally breathing and who had decided, with the quiet certainty of 7 years of waiting, that no force in the galaxy was going to take that away. On the rim, Riven took a hit. Plasma grazed across her ribs, cauterizing as it cut. The smell of burned biocomposite and something underneath it that was alive and damaged. She stumbled, caught herself against the array housing, and fired 3 more shots before her knees buckled. 2 connected, A Krell soldier pitched backward off the cliff face and fell silently into the canyon below. Kael pulled her behind cover. "You're hit. I noticed." She pressed one hand against the wound and raised her lance with the other. Fired again. Hit again. The Krell pushed harder. They were disciplined and numerous, and their firepower turned the canyon rim into a landscape of broken stone and scorched metal. Voss's amplified voice boomed across the canyon, ordering surrender in a tone that suggested she knew the answer and was following protocol for the record. The words echoed off the canyon walls and died in the amber sky. The Velhari response was silence and gunfire. Kael was down to his last power cell when the sky changed. The light shifted. A shadow passed across Marin's cradle's reflected glow, too fast and too large to be a cloud. And then the ship was there, dropping out of hyperspace with a violence that warped the air around it, a wedge of gray metal and running lights that materialized directly above the canyon like a fist unclenching. Alliance frigate, AES Resolute. Her identification transponder blazed across every frequency in the system, and her weapons were hot, and her broadcast cut through the chaos with the flat, unambiguous authority of a species that had spent decades learning how to project force across interstellar distances. "Attention, Krell vessels. This settlement is under Alliance protection. Any hostile action will be considered an act of war against the human alliance. Stand down immediately." Voss hesitated. The Krell didn't want this fight. Not here, not now, not with an Alliance warship overhead and a crew of 800 watching through targeting arrays that could track a pulse round from orbit. The political calculus was simple. A forgotten moon was not worth a war. Not today. Voss ordered withdrawal. The shuttles pulled back, engines rising in pitch as they climbed away from the canyon. The surveillance drone went dark. The whine of their drives faded into the amber distance and was gone. Silence settled over the canyon. Real silence, the kind that comes after the noise stops and the world remembers how to breathe. Then from somewhere below, a voice began, low and harmonic, rising from the settlement's depths. A single Velhari voice joined by another and another and another, until the canyon itself was vibrating with it. The sound wasn't celebration. It was older than that. Older than language, older than culture, something wired into the biology of a species that had survived long enough to face extinction and refused it. Riven, bleeding beside him, closed her eyes. Her mouth opened and the sound came from her too, involuntary, unstoppable, rising from the same place where grief lived and transforming into something else. Something that had no name in any human language, but that Kael understood anyway, in the way you understand sunlight or gravity or the sound of rain after drought. He sat on the canyon rim with the birthstone in one hand and a field bandage pressed to Riven's wound with the other, and he looked down at the settlement still standing below, lights glowing against the rock face, alive and defended and, for now, safe. He breathed. Days settled over Vela, for like sediment in still water. The Alliance established a provisional protection zone around the moon. Diplomatic channels opened with bureaucratic slowness, and the Krell filed protests through official channels that everyone understood were formalities. The calculus was simple. A war over a dead moon and 200 alien women wasn't worth the cost, and the Krell, for all their brutality, understood cost. The settlement was no longer hiding. For the first time in 7 years, the lights burned at full brightness. The biocomposite walls responded to the change, their patterns growing more vivid, more complex, as if the architecture itself could feel the difference between concealment and freedom. Women walked the upper terraces openly, their voices carrying across the canyon without the habitual whisper that caution had made instinct. Kael sat in the Whetstone's cockpit and ran numbers that didn't add up to a future. His cargo contract had defaulted 3 weeks ago. Penalties assessed, reputation flagged, clients reassigned. The hauling circuit was small enough that word traveled, and the word was that Kael Maddox had gone dark on a job and couldn't be relied on. Starting over would mean new contacts, new routes, new years of building trust in an industry that measured trust in delivered tonnage and on-time percentages. He stared at the nav console with its galaxy of possible destinations, all of them distant, All of them empty in a way he hadn't noticed before. 12 years of hauling cargo across systems he didn't care about, delivering things he didn't care about, sleeping in a ship that was home only in the sense that a foxhole is home. It keeps the rain off. It doesn't keep you warm. The Whetstone's fuel cells were full. Saleth had kept her word about that. The ship was flight-ready, engines green, systems nominal. The ramp was down and the air of Vela 4 drifted through the cabin, carrying that faint mineral smell he'd gotten used to. The taste of copper and cold stone, and something underneath it that was alive. The particular atmospheric signature of a place where people were growing bioluminescent crops and raising newborn children and learning how to exist without hiding. He'd gotten used to too many things. Dorn performed the extraction that activated Vela's pod on a Tuesday, or whatever the Velhari equivalent was. Kael asked to be present. The request surprised Dorn, which was visible only as a slight elevation of one eyebrow. The most dramatic emotional display he'd ever seen from her. The chamber was quiet, not the mechanical quiet of stasis systems humming, but the held breath quiet of people waiting for something they've been waiting for so long that the waiting itself has become a kind of identity. Vela stood beside the pod, her hands at her sides, her patterns flickering in that restless, searching rhythm that was as familiar to Kael as his own heartbeat. The pod opened the way all the others had. Slowly, gently, the biocomposite softening and parting like something alive yielding to something more alive. The fluid inside warmed, cleared, and the infant stirred. Her tiny fingers uncurled. Her mouth opened. She drew breath and cried. Vela made a sound he'd never heard from any species. Not grief and not joy. The place where they meet, the precise point where 7 years of waiting collapsed into a single moment of arrival. She lifted her daughter from the pod with hands that shook and held her against her chest, and her bioluminescent patterns erupted in a display so bright that the entire chamber pulsed with it, waves of white gold light that washed across every surface and made the air itself seem to glow. The women present answered with the harmonic, that deep involuntary tone that rose from somewhere primal, somewhere species deep, somewhere that language couldn't reach. The chamber filled with it, resonant and aching, and Kael stood in the middle of a sound that wasn't meant for him, but included him anyway, because he'd earned it, because he'd stayed. She named her Naya, First Light. Vela looked at Kael across the chamber, and for the first time since he'd known her, her patterns didn't shift, didn't pulse, didn't flicker with restless, searching energy. They held steady, a constant light, warm and even, like something that had finally found its frequency and intended to keep it. He looked back, and for once, he didn't look away. Riven found him at the Whetstone later. Her arm was in a sling, the plasma graze healing beneath Velhari medical gel that smelled like crushed leaves and something metallic. She stood at the base of the ramp and looked up at him where he sat in the open hatchway, his legs dangling over the edge, the amber light of Maren's cradle painting long shadows across the plateau. She didn't say thank you. That wasn't what she came to say. Gratitude was a currency Riven didn't deal in, and he respected her too much to expect it. "You fight like you have something to lose," she said. He looked at her, really looked, at the angular patterns on her skin that had softened fractionally since the battle, at the sling that held an arm that had gripped his wrist on a cliff face and kept him from falling, at the set of her jaw, which was still stubborn and still hard but no longer aimed at him. "Didn't used to," he said. She almost smiled. The expression was brief and unfamiliar on her face, like a muscle being tested after a long injury. It didn't quite complete itself, but the attempt was there, and the attempt was more than he'd ever seen from her. "That's the point," she said. She turned and walked back toward the settlement. Her stride was different, not softer, just aimed at something other than a wall. Saleth asked him nothing. She appeared at his quarters one evening and placed a data pad on the table beside his bed. He picked it up. A quarters assignment. His name rendered in Velhari script alongside the standard alphabet, assigned to a permanent residence within the settlement. A room with a window that faced the canyon and a door that, he noted, had a lock. He turned the data pad over in his hands. The biocomposite casing was warm, almost alive, and the Velhari characters of his name glowed faintly in the dim light. Someone had taken the time to learn how to spell it. Someone had decided he belonged here before he'd decided it himself. "I only wanted a bed for the night," he said. Saleth's patterns shifted, a slow, warm pulse that he'd learned to read as something close to affection, or maybe recognition, the acknowledgement of a choice made not in a single dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones, each too quiet to notice until they added up to something that couldn't be taken back. "And now?" she asked. He folded the assignment and put it in his vest pocket, next to the birthstone he still hadn't given back. Vela hadn't asked for it. He hadn't offered. Neither of them mentioned it, and the silence around that small carved stone said more than either of them was ready to put into words. It sat against his chest, warm, its bioluminescent veins pulsing in a rhythm that had synced with his heartbeat weeks ago, and he'd stopped noticing where the stone's pulse ended and his began. 43 down, he said. 304 to go. Saleth nodded. 304. She left without adding anything. There was nothing to add. The math was simple, the reasons were not. But simplicity had never been what kept a person in one place. The complicated things did that. The things that tangled around you while you weren't looking and made leaving feel less like freedom and more like amputation. That evening, Kael walked the settlement. The twilight held steady, amber and violet, Marin's cradle burning on the horizon like it always had and always would. Women nodded as he passed. Some smiled, some didn't, and that was fine too. The old woman, Thessaly, 400 years old and counting, touched his hand as she always did. Her patterns pulsed once, blue-white and faded. She said something in Velhari he still didn't understand, and he'd stopped asking for a translation because understanding would have changed it into something smaller than what it was. Somewhere in the deep shelters, an infant cried. Another voice answered, low and harmonic, and the crying settled. The whetstone sat on the plateau, fueled and flight-ready. He didn't lock it. He didn't need to. Kael Maddox had come to Vela 4 looking for a place to sleep. 8 hours horizontal, fuel in the tank, gone by morning. That was the deal, nothing else. He'd found something else. Not a grand revelation, not a moment of transformation that arrived with music and clarity, just a slow accumulation of small things. Marrow draws and shared meals and silent evenings beside a woman and her sleeping daughter. The weight of a birthstone in his pocket, the sound of a species remembering how to hope, the look on Riven's face when she handed him her weapon and trusted him not to fail. He walked the twilight settlement and let it matter. The sky was open, the light was steady, and for the first time in 12 years, Kael Maddox was exactly where he intended to be.